I am so pleased to be back in Little Rock. I have to tell you, I considered for a moment, I was a little tired, I thought, I know, I'll send Queen Latifah instead. I know that's really who you wanted anyway. But then I thought, no, I'll come and I'll do, because at the very least I can see my old haunts. I did cover the White House for the New York Times, and it's not insignificant that the person I covered for the New York Times was Bill Clinton. And it was because of Bill Clinton that I got to know Little Rock so well in 1992. I spent more nights sleeping in Little Rock than I did at home. But you know, the thing about covering Bill Clinton is it's the same thing as being governed by Bill Clinton. It was always a rock and roll experience. And you spend a lot of time thinking to yourself, okay, things are going to calm down, and then, it doesn't calm down again. So I guess it all prepared us for what we're witnessing now, in which things seem like they're never going to calm down again. I have to tell you about how I came to do this book project, because you may have heard a thing or two. You know, when I first decided I wanted to write this book, I didn't even know I had decided it, because I probably decided it when I first got into journalism. Because somewhere along the way, throughout my career, I discovered I kept running into this collision of race and politics. I loved covering politics. I just loved being a newspaper reporter. But I wasn't aware that all along the way, I did what reporters do, which is I was gathering little bits and pieces of things, and we call it gathering string, kind of sticking it in my hip pocket until one day I stopped and thought, you know, I have a story here. And the story wasn't all about Barack Obama, but Barack Obama caused people to pay attention to the story. The story was about this whole group of folks who came along at a time. You know, that word change is a complicated word. It sounds great, and it's easy, and it's short, and it's punchy, but it's hard, and it's complicated, and it happens over time, not with one fell swoop. So along the way, I kept watching all these little pieces, these progressions on the way to where we are now and where we have yet to go. My very first job when I got out of college was in Boston, at the Boston Herald-American in the 1970s. In Boston, you know, people talked about the South and its racial problems, but let me tell you, the North had its issues, and this was 1977, it was still having its issues. And when I got my first job, one of the things they gave me to cover was school committee, which sounds like a nice little entry-level job until you discover what happened when I arrived. I start the book this way. I learned how to cover race riots by telephone. They didn't pay me enough at my first newspaper job to venture onto the grounds of South Boston High School when bricks were being thrown. Instead, I would telephone the headmaster and ask him to relay to me the number of broken chairs in the cafeteria each day. And then a white colleague would be dispatched to fill in the details for me. I've spent 30 years in journalism since then. I started when I was 2. In case you were confused. I've spent 30 years in journalism since then, chronicling stories just like that. Places where truth and consequences collide, rub up against each other, and shift history's course. And none of that prepared me for 2008 and the astonishing rise of Barack Obama. It's true that he accomplished what no black man had before, but it went further than that. Simply as an exercise in efficient politics, Obama 08 rewrote the textbook. His accomplishment was historic and one that transformed how race and politics intersect in our society. Obama is the leading edge of this change, but his success is merely the ripple in a pond that grows deeper every day. David Axelrod, who is Obama's chief strategist, spoke to me after the election, and he said, when people do something they've never done before, I think that makes it easier to do it a second time. So when people vote for an African-American candidate, I think it makes it easier for the next African-American candidate. The next African-American candidate, and a fair share of those already in office, subscribe to a formula driven as much by demographics as by destiny. When population shifts occur, brought about by fair housing laws, affirmative action, landmark school desegregation rulings, political power is challenged as well. It happened in Boston, New York, Chicago, and every other big city reshaped by an influx of European immigration, and it's happening again now in Miami and Los Angeles, in suburban Virginia and North Carolina, where the political calculus is being reshaped by Latino immigrants. With African Americans freighted with the legacy of slavery and the pushback from whites who refuse to feel guilty for the sins of their ancestors, the shift has been scattered and sporadic, yet no less profound. So when I started to add it up, I realized that at some point during my career, I kept coming back to this little conflict, this little moment in which we were all trying to come to grips with who we are as a country. Race has always been the thing that drove us to always re-examine ourselves along the way, for good and for ill. So I began to think, because of my love of politics, who is out there? Who else is out there? Certainly Barack Obama is not alone. Part of the drama I had leading into the vice presidential debate this year, when people decided, without having seen the manuscript, that I was writing a Barack Obama puff book, that was just to throw me off my game. I knew what was going on. But part of the reason why that was interesting to me is because a lot of people were willing to buy into the notion that that was what I must be writing, because they couldn't conceive that there might be a bigger story here, that it wasn't just about him, that it was about a generation of folks, some of who had preceded him in office, like Deval Patrick of Massachusetts, who'd been elected governor in 2006. Now, keep in mind that when I started writing this book, Deval Patrick, this was a slippery topic. Deval Patrick was the only black governor in the 50 United States. I turned on TV one day and there was Eliot Spitzer standing at a microphone, and voila, there were 2 black governors. Things kept changing. But then I looked at someone like Cory Booker, who's the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, who went to Stanford and Oxford and got all these this incredible pedigree. He'd been raised in a lily-white suburb of Newark, never lived a day in Newark. His parents, in fact, had sued to integrate the town of Harrington Park, New Jersey, so they could buy a home there. So he was raised in a conscious household, but he wasn't raised to go out and march and do all kinds of, radical things. Yet, when he came back with all of his degrees, what he wanted to be drawn to was public service. Here we are in a school of public service. And this is what all of these folks decided to do. He decided to work as a community attendant organizer in public housing in Newark, and then he ran for city council, then he ran twice for mayor. And the interesting thing about him running once and losing before he ran again and won is it's a running theme with all of these breakthrough candidates, is that someone tells them, sonny boy or a little girl, just sit over there and wait. It'll be your turn soon enough. And they all go, thank you so much. I'll be moving on now. I'll be ignoring you. I heard this story over and over again. I heard it from mayors. I heard it from city council presidents. I heard it from a lot of people who had lived through all these different experiences and yet had common ones. They weren't serving the same jobs, but they were having the same kinds of experiences. One of the things I found interesting that they all had in common is that someone would ask each one of them, whenever you accomplish something, whenever you've broken through, when all of a sudden you're really a big deal, then your own people would start to say, so are you black enough? Now I remember thinking, what kind of ridiculous question? That's kind of obvious, isn't it? But then I began to hear it so much that I began to think maybe there's a question that needs to be answered here, because the only people asking this question were African Americans asking it of African Americans. White people were basically asking, is he a little too black? Which is where the Jeremiah Wright thing came. But the interesting thing about it is how many of them told me that they were questioned about their racial authenticity. How many of them, after having accomplished all the things that their parents had schooled them to do, got to the point where they were about to break through and someone said, well, I don't know if I trust you. And so I found that it was no different for Barack Obama than for any of these others. Cory Booker heard it in Newark, Deval Patrick heard it in Massachusetts, Artur Davis, the congressman from Alabama, who, by the way, is now running for governor of Alabama. Talk about the audacity of hope. He may do it, who knows? But it's still a breathtaking ambition. And they all heard the same question. I call it the politics of identity. On the night Barack Obama won the South Carolina primary, his supporters could barely contain themselves. Bouncing back from a surprise defeat 2 weeks before in New Hampshire, the double-digit victory thrilled the multiracial crowd gathered that night in the heart of the South. When their candidate appeared, they took up a chant. Race doesn't matter. Race doesn't matter. The chant spread and it built throughout the room. Now, standing at the foot of the stage in this ballroom, just blocks from the state capitol, Obama's pollster, an African-American named Cornell Belcher, was watching in astonishment. He said to me after the election, when I called him to remind him of that night, here you are in South Carolina, 3 blocks from where the Confederate flag is still flying in front of the state capitol, and all the history that's held in that state. And you have a group of young white people shouting, race doesn't matter. Now, do they think there is no racism? No. But were they screaming and shouting the world they wanted to exist? Yeah. That is powerful and profound and very different. So here we were coming this very different election. A very different election which, even though the person who was the leading candidate in the end was an African-American man, wasn't precisely about race. Yet our country never gets far from things which are mostly about race, or which are driven, if not completely defined by race. But the conversation wasn't just interracial, which is what we're used to, people fighting with each other across racial lines. It was intraracial as well. People forget that when Barack Obama first started running, black people were not on board. They were with Hillary. And they were looking at him and thinking, how do you say that name? And where did he come from? And who sent him? And how long has he been around? And do I really want to get out there on a limb with someone who's going to fail? So it wasn't, interestingly enough, until Iowa, you will recall, that black folks said, okay, well, maybe Are you from Iowa? Is that what that was? I don't know. I got a little clap about that. It wasn't until Iowa that people woke up and said, well, maybe this is a possibility, and that's where African Americans got on board. It was not at all a done deal. But within the black community, the skepticism about Obama and the skepticism about all of these black candidates almost always broke down along generational lines. In fact, the generational split, I would argue, is probably a more significant story than the racial split in this year. It was a generational push that brought so many people into Barack Obama's camp. Caroline Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, Claire McCaskill, the senator from Missouri, Robert Casey, the senator from Pennsylvania, all said they decided to come out and endorse Barack Obama because their children asked them to. Their children who never paid attention to their careers or to politics before, all of a sudden were talking to them about politics, which made them think, maybe I need to listen to this. So this generational breakthrough was not insignificant, but it was also interesting the way it was playing out within the African American community. I did a chapter in here about legacy politics, the fathers, the sons, the daughters, the mothers, the people who have inherited the legacy of political and public service. The interesting, thing about this, of course, is that it's about a generation old, because African Americans didn't get political office until the 60s and 70s. So now their children are coming of age. And it turns out that even though they appreciate what their parents have done, they're not necessarily of the same world view. So I went up to talk to the person who came to mind first, of course, were the Jacksons. I'm not thinking about Tito or Michael or Marlon. I can name them all, which dates me. I'm talking about, obviously, Jesse Jackson Sr. and Jr. I went to talk to Jesse Jackson Jr., who's, of course, a congressman from Illinois, who I first met when he was working on his father's campaign in 1988. He was a good, loyal lieutenant to Dad. But now, as an African-American congressman from Chicago, he didn't necessarily see the world the same way his father saw it. This is what he said to me. There is a movement in the black community toward accountable leadership. The paradigm for the unaccountable leaders has radically shifted. I consider very respectfully, he said, and this is for the record, he said, my father to be part of the unaccountable leadership, even though I completely believe in and trust his mission and his motives for that which he does. But, he continued, the press conference, television visibility, lack of follow-through, everything is a civil rights issue paradigm with leadership is profoundly unaccountable to the masses of people and to history. Remarkable words coming from the son of a man who practically invented the everything is a civil rights issue campaign. Don't get him wrong, he continued. There is a place for the agitation and protest politics of a Jesse Jackson Sr. and an Al Sharpton, but it is not here, not now. So, of course, I had to go knock on the Reverend's door. The elder Jackson is keenly aware of his son's apostasy. He said, I encourage in our house vigorous debate. And there is no punishment for a different point of view. We have different roles. Jackson Sr. is the agitator, the younger one is the negotiator. He also says, if Jesse makes, this is Jesse Sr. talking about Jesse Jr., if Jesse makes certain moves, if he needs to distinguish his own name and reputation from mine, I understand that. I see the gist, the transition, what his options are now, where he's hugging them in '08. I was putting them out in '72. But even though they get along, even though I would love to be at their Thanksgiving Day table, even though they see the world much the same, it is very interesting how much different the world really is for them. I have to say that I believe that Jesse Jackson Sr. didn't quite get the credit he deserves for the kind of breakthrough he staged in '84 and '88. Not because he ran for president and lost, but because he ran for president and changed people's minds about what was possible in coalition politics. Because a whole lot of people who voted for him and a whole lot of people who voted for this president were not just people who were voting for him because he was black. And that changed the worldview a little bit. So that's important that there is that struggle going on. But there's another struggle going on, and that was what was happening between other people who were not necessarily related, who were older and younger. The new NAACP chairman is a guy by the name of Ben Jealous. He's 35 years old, at least he was when he was elected. He came from Amnesty International, National Newspaper Publishers Association. He didn't come from a pulpit. He didn't come from elected office. The first time the NAACP has picked someone like that. So you can imagine the distinction and the difference and the disagreement which had to go on within that organization to embrace this new way. But this is not something that's new. This is something that had been going on for a long time. I want to read just one story that Ben Jealous told me. It was a 1993 march in Washington. It was the 50th anniversary. 50, I can't add. It was the 25th anniversary, no, 50th, 40th anniversary of the march, of the I Have a Dream speech. Yes, 30th anniversary of the, this is why I'm a writer. Anyway, they go to Washington, and there are two stages. The historically powerful Lincoln Memorial Podium, and what Jealous and others called the kiddie stage, on the grounds of the Washington Monument. He said, everyone was talking about time to pass the torch, time to pass the torch. Well, it didn't sit well with me. Instead, Jealous listened to the words of one of the older speakers, civil rights activist Julian Bond, who had gotten wind of the dissension on the kiddie stage. He said to me, if you perceive that I have a torch that represents power and you want it, you shouldn't be asking for it. You should snatch it. So here we go. We go through these people who have been snatching power from their elders. Artur Davis, who I mentioned earlier, he won election to Congress his second time running because he defeated an entrenched black incumbent. And he did it even though the black power structure in Alabama had asked him not to run, had told him to step aside. He's doing the same thing now as he runs for governor. Deval Patrick was elected governor of Massachusetts, even though he had never even run for dog catcher. Not one thing ever in his life. Came out of left field, and he won the nomination and then won the governorship. The same thing has also happened in mayor's offices. I talked to the mayor of Buffalo, New York, who knew he was African American. I didn't know that. I talked to the mayor of Columbus, Ohio. I talked to the mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio, and they all have an interesting and very similar point of view about what leadership means now for African Americans, and it's not so different from the way the president describes it, which it's kind of an outside-in approach, which is instead of saying, I'm going to march for jobs, justice, and peace for black people, or I'm going to close the disparity in healthcare access for African Americans or people of color, they say, I'm going to fix the whole healthcare system, and the people who will disproportionately benefit will be people of color, by definition. It's the way the president sees it, and it's a way an amazing number of these young folks, younger folks, because some of them are in their 50s, see it. Now, they didn't have a meeting to decide it. They just came of age at a time when they didn't have to fight for access the way their parents did. Their parents had to march and sit at lunch counters. Their children don't even know what lunch counters are because they don't exist anymore. So they have figured that there is another approach and that the approach has to be more inclusive. I talked to one young man who's at times 23 years old, member of the state legislature of South Carolina. His father, his name is Bakari Sellers. His father, Cleveland Sellers, was arrested in the Orangeburg massacre in South Carolina. And so his father was, with Jesse Jackson, a state organizer in '84 and '88. He was the original civil rights protester. His son, who completely loves him, and in fact, the first thing he hung on his office wall when he became a state legislator in South Carolina was a picture of Jesse Jackson holding him when he was 4 years old. So he appreciates and loves this, but when he talks of this history, but when he talks about what faces South Carolina now, he says he drives the back streets of South Carolina. He doesn't see black poverty and white poverty. He just sees poverty. And he sees not black schools and white schools, but schools that need public help. So they look at this informed by the history of their parents and informed by race, but not limited to it, not defined by it. One of the interesting things I found as I've gone around the country talking about this book is there seems to be an interest in having this conversation again, but we have to get out of some old habits. One of our old habits is we're kind of scared to talk about race. We would prefer to erase it if possible. I got a letter once, an email from a viewer who said, you know, I don't understand why you keep calling Barack Obama black. Well, first of all, I don't. They were watching some other station. But that said, he went on to say, this viewer, he went on to say, why can't we just forget that he's black? And that brought me up short. And I responded, well, now why do we want to forget that he's black unless we consider it to be a negative? That brought him up short. Because in fact, if we consider race to be a negative, we're never going to have an honest conversation. If we consider it to be part of what we are, but not all of what we are, we can begin to have that. When I wake up in the morning, I don't go, oh darn, I'm black again. I think it's a good thing. And I think it's part of who I am and part of what defines me. And if you look at me and say that you're colorblind, that means you're blind. That means you want to erase a bit of who I am. So why would you want to do that unless you think it's a bad thing? So here we are now in this world where we can maybe get past the discussion of race as a negative. But we can talk about our racial history, our racial lives, and our racial accomplishments, not only as racial accomplishments, but accomplishments for the entire country. I'll stop for now after I want to read you one more thing, and I'd love to take your questions. I interviewed Barack Obama for this book early on, and I wanted to ask him about this because if you paid attention to his campaign, you notice he went out of his way not to mention race. Even though in his books, if you read it, you can tell he gave it a lot more thought to his racial identity than most of us ever have to. But when it came time for running for office, he is ascribed to a pretty old-fashioned theory of politics, which is you do what you can to close the gap between yourself and the people who are listening to you, not to remind them of the differences. You want them to understand that you have more in common, and therefore you will represent them. And that's what you do, whether it's a difference between being old and young, being female and male, being black, white, Latino, Asian. It doesn't matter. You're trying to close the gaps. But so he didn't talk about it that much. But when I did ask him about it straight on, it was kind of interesting because he told me about a conversation, which I'm not going to find now. Hold on a second. He told me about a conversation that he had with Jesse Jackson. Here it is. He said something that's very accurate, Obama told me. He said, Barack, we had to break the door down, which means sometimes you're not polite. You get blooded up a little bit. You get some scars. You haven't had to go through that, and that's a good thing. That's part of what we went through. I don't expect you to have the same battle scars that I did. So he doesn't have the same battle scars. None of them do. But they have a sensibility, an understanding of what those battles were and what the scars mean. That's why in the end, John Lewis, the congressman from Atlanta who had endorsed Hillary Clinton but changed to Barack Obama, changed his mind because he felt that the scars that he had suffered meant that he might now end up, after all, on the wrong side of history if he stayed where he was. It was a wrenching decision for him, but it was a decision which is interesting in how unusual it was among many of the old guard and many of the new guard. So the scars are there, the breakthrough is there, and I think we're just beginning to see it spread. I'll stop there and take your questions. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
Excuse me while I clear my 76-year-old throat. I have, first of all, a personal favor I'd like to ask of you, and then a question. One of your contemporaries that you've worked with, he and I graduated from the University of Missouri School of Journalism together, and I have a very important question that I need to get to him. And I wonder
Depends who it is.
Jim Lair.
I can arrange that.
Thank you. Now, my question is, as I walk up here and hand it to you, that way I can tell him that
Do I get to look at it?
No.
Oh. What if it gets me fired?
I promise you it won't. All I'm trying to do is...
Y'all didn't fight over anybody, did you?
My
Okay.
daughter told me to write that this morning.
Okay, I'll give it
And
to
she
him.
wants to have dinner with Jim and Kate and my wife and I in Washington at his convenience, and that's what it's all about.
Okay.
My question is, if you can go back to the day after Barack Obama received the Democratic nomination, in your heart of hearts, as a reporter and as a African-American reporter, what chance did you think he had of getting elected?
Better chance than I thought a month before. I have a come clean here. I didn't think Barack Obama was going to be president. I am wrong about everything. I didn't think Hillary Clinton would run for Senate. I didn't think that Joe Lieberman was going to get elected to Senate in 2000. I can give you a whole list of elected officials on Capitol Hill who still give me the evil eye because it was clear that I didn't think they were going to make it. And so this is why I'm a pundit. I'm not a pundit. It's why I'm a reporter. But it should be said that, reporters love nothing better than a great story. And whether we knew the outcome or not or suspected the outcome, it was such a great story. And the first moment I had where I was able to, I think, pull my nose back from the glass, your nose is pressed against the glass as a reporter all the time, was election night. When I was sitting in the studio, the NewsHour were covering the returns, and you'll remember that at 11 o'clock at night, everybody declared Barack Obama the president. I was sitting with two pollsters on either side of me, and we're crunching numbers and looking at the exit polls, and all of a sudden at 11 o'clock at night, I hear Jim Lehrer say, and Barack Obama is the 44th president of the United States. And I have to say, I stopped for a moment, I kind of did like this, and my little pollster friends were sitting there, and they said, Gwen, are you okay? And I said, I'm just having a black moment. And then I went right back to work.
All right, questions. We got other questions. Let's see. Right here, we have a question right here. He's coming right up.
As candidates who are of African descent run for office, what are the perils of being too black as they campaign?
Yeah, I hinted at that, but didn't really get into it, didn't I? Well, the perils are no different from what I was alluding to when I talk about the difference between you and the people you're trying to win. If you were the first generation of African-American politicians who won office largely in majority black districts, where you didn't have to worry pretty much about appealing to people who looked and sounded and thought differently than you did. But when you began to run statewide and when they began to run in districts which weren't specifically carved out by the Voting Rights Act in order to benefit black candidates, then they had to find a way to appeal to people who might just not know who they were or not feel comfortable with someone who wasn't what they were used to. And so that's when you stay away from part of it is you stay away from the too black moniker, but part of it is just not who a lot of these well-educated, sophisticated black politicians are anymore. They've grown up in interracial environments. They've spent a lot of time being comfortable in mixed environments. So they wouldn't necessarily be the kind of people you would expect to, I don't know, break into a blues song or whatever people think too black is at a campaign event. But they were also, but that didn't matter, because as long as you seemed different. I had a guy at one of these book events stand up and say to me, well, it was kind of a middle-aged white guy, and he said, so it seems to me that Barack Obama is really well-spoken and you're really well-spoken. Isn't that the real problem, that black people don't speak well? And I said, and all white people do, right? So, there's just that's a big laugh in Arkansas. I don't get that laugh like that every place else. But I'm telling you that it's one of these things where you just have to find some way to deal with what people's ideas are, get past their prejudice, if that's what it is. That's almost too hard a word for what it is sometimes. Get past their unfamiliarity, and see if you can get them to listen. Once you get them to listen, they vote.
Questions?
I'm the Helen Thomas of Arkansas.
Oh, no. You had right to her.
Early in my country's history, it was against the law. Early in my country's history, it was against the law to let slaves and their descendants have education. Abraham Lincoln overruled that law when he freed slaves in this country. And then in 1954, it was overturned and all people could be educated to the max. Barack represents part of that beneficiary of history. My question is, I believe educated human capital is the best national defense America has. Do you believe human capital, educated human capital?
Wouldn't you be shocked if I disagreed with you? Come on. No, of course. I mean, if there's one thing that these breakthrough candidates have in common, is that they and their parents have created a world which allowed them to get access to the greatest possible knowledge base out there for them. It's not that folks weren't always smart. It's not that folks weren't always accomplished and able to create. It was that they didn't have access to the extra oomph you need in order to break all the way through. So yeah, I mean, this is something which I believe there's no politicians, no elected officials, there's no president I've ever covered who would disagree with the notion that, or even a mayor or a city council member, that if you don't build business unless you build education first. Now, we're having some trouble with that in this country, especially when it comes to public education, but it certainly is a true fact. Nobody challenges that.
This lady right here. Yeah.
I love the way you laid out the political worldview of that generation of elected black officials who had snatched the torch from the older generation, and how you said that they did not eschew race, but they started there appreciating that legacy,
right,
and yet embraced a larger vision that was inclusive and could systemically impact and fix things that needed fixing on a really large scale. And I just thought that was a beautiful way of honoring, racial legacy, but also moving into almost like a whole, new age, more visionary way of trying to change the world. And as you were saying that,
what's your question?
My question is, I was thinking that put a whole new spin on the concept of post-racial, and was wondering if there were a way that you could think about getting people to think about post-racial in that sense, as opposed to that old slash and divide.
It's hard. I used the term post-racial once to Joe Lowry, and he almost took my head off because he just didn't believe there was such a thing. But I do agree with you that it is, you know what it is? It's a continuum. It's not this is where we were and this is where we're going to be tomorrow. When you think about it, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, they were under 40 years old when they were at the peak of their powers. And they died too soon, but they were under 40 years old. So they had to snatch it from another generation before them. The interesting thing to me is the people who aren't willing to hand over the torch now when they were that age, they were taking it too. So this keeps happening in waves and waves and waves, and I think each time we end up on a higher plateau.
Yes, sir, wait, right here, Mike. Yeah, right here. Right there.
You mentioned and write about Artur Davis and Cory Booker, who had to challenge and defeat older generation African-American politicians to win their offices. Barack Obama tried to do that in 2000 when he ran against Bobby Rush, the incumbent member of the House. What do you think he took away from that experience?
He has said he took away that he ran a pitiful campaign. And that you don't win just because you decide it's your turn. That's the coda to the it's get out of your turn part. It's interesting. Since this book has come out, so many things have happened. I'm going to have to rewrite it completely for the paperback because, when Bobby Rush resurfaced most recently is when Roland Burris was picked to replace, under some cloud, to replace Barack Obama in the U.S. Senate. And there was this press conference that happened in which Bobby Rush walked in late and defended Roland Burris and said he should have the job basically because he's a black man and this is a black seed, and that was really his whole reasoning. And I thought I was going back in a time tunnel, because here was a former Black Panther, 70-some years old now, standing next to another guy who's 70-some years old, claiming race is the sole reason for holding onto a seat. Completely the opposite of what we had just seen accomplished in this presidential election. So it's been an interesting time. And a part of that was just good old Chicago politics, which is what Barack Obama learned firsthand when he ran against Bobby Rush and lost some years before.
We've got a lot of young people here and no young people questions. So any young people have I want to make sure that you get recognized. We got a student question or young person? Let's see a hand out here. If we're going to pass the torch, you better seize it. Here's one over here. Anybody? Okay. Go ahead. But
I dare you to tell her she's not young, Skip.
That's all right. She can. I wouldn't go there, Gwen.
Yeah, I know.
I'm not sure exactly how to ask the question, but I'll try. The head of the GOP now is an African American, and how do you, I just feel like that's such a strange thing to me to think of African Americans as conservative Republicans. And I know this is just a natural progression of societal norms or whatever, but what kind of an impact do you think that any kind of conservative of African Americans is going to have on future,
Well,
politics?
I think that the Republican Party is dealing with far more profound identity issues right now than have to do with race. It is not an accident. I mean, Michael Steele is, he's not just brand new. They didn't pluck him out of obscurity to make him Republican Party chairman, and they didn't do it because they thought, oh, there's a black president, let me put in a black, because he wouldn't have fought so hard to win if that were the case. Now, he hasn't been doing a stellar job so far, but I just turned to a page in the book because I interviewed Michael Steele for the book at some point, and I was struck by it because I was realizing, among other things, I was realizing that I didn't have a lot of black Republicans in this book, and I didn't know where the Republicans were. And I know there was a story about why there were no black Republican breakthroughs, at least none that I could find, and I wanted to be sure that I figured it out. Now, one of the things I stumbled across was this information from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which found that black identification with the GOP dropped 60% between 2004 and 2008. Only 4% of African Americans in October identified themselves as Republican. Now, keep in mind, I went to the Republican National Convention 4 years ago, and I think 7% of the delegates were black. This year it was 2%. It was so bad that if I walked on the floor to go interview somebody, people would embrace me thinking I was a delegate.
Question.
I just want to read one more thing that Michael Steele said when we talked. He said, heck, even Giuliani, even though most blacks in New York can't stand him, he did get a certain level of vote that was higher than most of the Republicans got. The civil rights movement, that central moment of August of 1963 when Dr. King gave that famous speech, he wasn't speaking to people in front of them. He was speaking to this generation. He was giving them the blueprint that they would need in order to realize the fulfillment of the American dream. Michael Steele does get that his party needs to be more diverse. It is possible to be black and conservative, honest to God. Black people are pretty conservative. However, you have to speak to their needs, just like you have to speak to the needs of any group of people. It doesn't have to be, we are less party identified as a nation than we have been.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My name is Sanford Johnson, a recent graduate of the Clinton School of Public Service, and I have a two-part question.
He's a future politician.
This one really is.
I can tell.
I'll use the thumb over the fist as I ask this too. The first part of the question would be, when you look just at the South, what southern states do you think are ready to elect African Americans on a statewide level? And the second part, what African Americans do you see as being well positioned to be that next big win?
What do you have in mind?
Yeah, why don't you tell her?
I've started a nonprofit in my home state of Mississippi, which is kind of like Artur Davis, I guess. I've thought about doing politics at some point. It's been a thought that I've thought about, but yeah. That's about it.
Well, no, that's it. I asked you that because you probably have given this even more thought than I have. I can tell you that it's very interesting. In Alabama, there is this statewide race going on. South Carolina, that young man I talked to, Bakari Sellers, keep an eye on him. He's going to run one day. Someone asked him if he's going to be the next Obama. He says, I don't know about Washington. I don't like it that much, but I really do like that state capital. And as you go through state by state, you begin to see possibilities. There is a statewide elected official in Texas. It's the railroad commissioner. He's Republican. There is in Georgia. It's he's in the book. Thurbert Baker is the attorney general, and he is now running for Senate, I think. Governor? Senate. And so there are a lot of people who are percolating to the top in a lot of these states. But I'm still waiting to see whether there's going to be a great gathering force in the South. I do think that a lot of people who didn't think there were possibilities before think there are now. Now, here's a reality check. Artur Davis told me before the general election that he was figuring on 40% of the white vote going for Barack Obama, and if that happened, he would be in a good position for his gubernatorial race. Only 20% of the white vote went for Barack Obama in Alabama, so he's now rejiggering his numbers a little bit.
Got a question here. Judge Griffin, you have a question?
Your comment raises another issue. Given that Barack Obama only got 20% of the white vote, is the success of these younger black politicians the portent of things to come in future foreseeable election cycles, or should we read them as blips historically in time?
Well, he only got 20% of the white vote in Alabama. Nationally, he got 43% of the white vote, which was more than John Kerry got in 4 years before. So the trajectory is going in that direction. I don't think it's a blip. I don't think it's a blip because I think a lot of the successes preceded Barack Obama, and he did not start the ball rolling, but he certainly is the most visible and obvious example of his success. And I also think that there is a new approach to which bodes well for there being more instead of fewer, which is this idea that you're speaking to everyone, not just to proscribed groups of black people only, you speak to them only about their issues as if black people have no issues that are beyond them, and as if white people have no issues that they share with black folk. I think that there is a broader way of approaching it, which makes it easier to imagine future success.
We got time for one more question.
Thank you. I want you to say also to your brother, who's a good friend of mine down in Atlanta.
You know my brother, too? Lord have mercy. You got a letter for him, too?
No. But I'm Dr. R.J. Hampton, and in writing your new book, I think I want to say ditto to...
You must be an AME.
I am.
Yeah.
I was.
I was? Ooh, we're going to talk about that.
But you may not know, but I ran for governor in 1970, and possibly the first black to run on a ticket, on a general ticket. Mm-hmm. And I was a successful black man, 34 years old, and on newspaper, printing company, public relations firm, and so forth, president of college. But that was the worst experience I ever had in my life. I still haven't gotten over it.
Why?
They told me, blacks told me, that I didn't ask them, could I run? You know, I'm giving you a deeper insight.
No, that's what all of these folks say.
And for 18 months after I ran, nobody called me. 18 months. Before then, my phone rang all the time because I was a president of college and doing a lot of things. But for 18 months, and maybe that's because we haven't got anybody yet, they saw what they did to me. And I had to leave the state. I got a job offer in Mississippi, and my wife said, no, we're not going to Mississippi. And then I got a job offered me in Kansas, with Miles Cities. And I was on my way to that job when I ran into Bumpers, Governor Bumpers, who we ran the same year. And he asked me where was I going. I said, I'm going to get a job. He said, you're going to get a job? I said, I can't get a job in Arkansas. He said, what? He said, we can't lose somebody like you. He said, don't go there, go back home. And somebody will call you Monday morning. That's how I got back. Luther Black called me with adult education. But this is the problem. I want to know, I don't know, I want to see that right now we're the only state, I think, in the whole South that doesn't have a constitutional officer. We don't have a governor. We don't have anybody in that position. And maybe, I'm searching for what can be done, that we can have somebody. And I think a thing to do, I want to say that black people never gave up on white people, never gave up on themselves. They never gave up on their God, they believed. But, what can we do to erase possibly this, that we can get some representation on the state level? I think it's a disgrace almost that we don't have.
Good question.
It's a great question, and I'm not equipped to answer, partly because I'm not an Arkansas expert, and partly because I don't give people advice. But I would just say it this way. There is a history in our country of creating a pipeline. And if there is no pipeline, it requires a couple things. It requires a possibility, someone thinking it's possible. Some people may look at what happened to you and say, forget it, I'm going to move somewhere else and try to do this. I don't need to be treated that way. Some people may also look at this and say, you know what, no one has asked me, no one has approached me because it feels like such a closed system. I don't know if that's true, but that may be happening. I don't know if there have been efforts made since 1970, which after all is quite a while ago now, in order to do that. I mean, we're almost 40 years later, and you would think there must have been somebody else who's made the effort to run statewide. And if there hasn't, you have to examine what is about the structure which has discouraged that. It's not just about individual ambition, and it's not just about, the white man kept me down or the black man kept me down. It's about creating a situation and cultivating an environment. I mean, one of the great things about this school is it cultivates an environment of people who want to serve. And some of them want to serve by choosing politics, and some of them want to serve by choosing different kinds of public service. One of the things I discovered, by the way, which I wasn't asked about, but I just bring it up in this book, is that I realized I didn't have that many women. And I went looking, thinking, where are the women? Where are they? They must be out here. I mean, I'm here. They must be here. Well, I found out a couple things. One is that women have a different set, and this may be true for a lot of the folks you wish you would see running. They have a different set of priorities. Women are raising their families. Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker of the House when she was a grandmother. It's not an accident. But I also think that women ultimately are serving in different ways, and that a lot of public service people are drawn to public service without being drawn to politics. The two things are not necessarily interchangeable. There are women and there are folks of color leading nonprofits in ways that there weren't before. And there are people who maybe, because of the success of the breakthrough candidates like Barack Obama, begin to take a second look at politics and think that maybe that is another way to serve. But you can't discount the fact that for years and years and years, people just didn't think politics was the honorable path. And maybe now it is again.